problem is that they have redefined the term racism. And in fact, if you listen to them, what they tell you will suggest that, of course, I automatically would be a racist by virtue of my skin color. In fact, it's an incurable condition.
To get Brexit.
Make America great again.
No, no, no.
Hello, this is Stephen Edginton for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Bret Weinstein. Bret Weinstein is a US academic, biologist, and evolutionary theorist. He's also part of what's called the intellectual dark web. We're going to be talking all about the woke movement, Black Lives Matter, the US election, and evolutionary theory. Bret, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for having me. So you're part of what's called the intellectual dark web, which is a really interesting bunch of intellectuals on YouTube and online. Can you explain how you joined that incident in Evergreen in 2017 that sort of brought you to mainstream providence? What happened?
Well, so one does not join the intellectual dark web. It's an informal designation that has been applied to me, to my wife, to Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Joe Rogan, and quite a number of others. The term was coined by my brother, Eric Weinstein. The event that catalyzed public awareness of me was a meltdown at the college where I was teaching. I'd been teaching there for 14 years. I was very popular with students. And in 2017, there was a set of proposals advancing through the college architecture that basically equity and diversity proposals that, as they were formulated, were a terrible threat to the college's ability to continue to function. And as a faculty member, it was my obligation to help govern the college. And I pointed out how dangerous these proposals were. And that caused me to be branded a racist. And some agitators at the school created a protest. 50 students who I had never met showed up at my class and demanded my firing or my resignation. The protests quickly descended into riots. The president of the college stood down the campus police force and allowed students to patrol with weapons in what they called community patrols, but what were really a bullying group that actually confronted other students. In one case, a student was battered. In other cases, students were intimidated. And these events were all filmed and uploaded to YouTube, which brought a tremendous amount of attention to the meltdown and to my role as the lightning rod at the center of it.
What happened to those students? Because it's an interesting question. Those students probably aren't stupid. I mean, all around the world, you've seen thousands of these, what I would call kind of woke, far left activists rise up, especially in 2020. Over in the UK, there's a whole bunch of students from the Black Lives Matter protests at Oxford University, who some of which have said some of the most abhorrent things about white people. They're basically Marxists. These people aren't idiots, but somehow they got to a point where they felt like shouting at you, someone who is a progressive, that you're racist. So how did they basically, in my view, become radicalized?
Well, there are two questions there. One is what happened to them after they did this, and the other is how did they get where they are? And I think the story of how they got where they are is similar everywhere. And that is to say, there are a small number of bad actors. There are another group of people who are confused by issues in the present moment. And the two things combine to create an attractive force. And what people don't seem to understand about this movement is that although what it declares, what it says it believes, is incredibly foolish, and what it proposes is incredibly dangerous, the strategy that causes it to spread is incredibly smart. And so by creating a dynamic in which anybody who expresses skepticism of the movement is targeted, it incentivizes people to adopt. And then once they've adopted it, those people rationalize these beliefs. So obviously wrong-headed ideas are spreading like wildfire because people are effectively afraid to acknowledge that they don't agree. And once they've failed to acknowledge it, the rest is done internally by a rationalization process. As for what happened to the students, that's an interesting story. The college pretended that they were disciplined, which is not the case. The college played a shell game where it took a lot of disciplinary matters that had nothing to do with the protests and riots and pretended that they had been responsive to them. One of the students, in fact, the ringleader of the movement, somebody who was involved not only in bullying fellow students and organizing the protest at my classroom, but somebody who actually kidnapped on videotape administrators of the college and arranged to have them held against their will, even to the point that the president of the college was unable to go to the bathroom on his own. He had to have an escort to make sure, I guess, that he didn't escape. But in any case, that student was hired the summer after the riots to help rewrite the student code of conduct. He was actually paid by the college to help write the rules for the rest of the student body, which tells you something about just how crazy this movement is and how far people who are trying to ingratiate themselves will go in order to stay in its good graces.
And what happened to you? I know that you spoke in front of Congress after this incident and you launched a lawsuit against the college. Can you talk about the impact it's had on your academic career in the last 3 years?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I did testify in front of Congress, and the events brought a great deal of attention to me. So I have started a podcast, the Dark Horse podcast, which is quite successful, and I've been invited to speak all over the world. The academic part of my life has been severely interrupted. In fact, most colleges would have very little to do with me because they are, of course, concerned that the stigmas that were leveled at me will be leveled at them. The one exception has been Princeton University, where the James Madison program has brought me and my wife on as visiting fellows. So we're very grateful to them for their courage.
You, as a progressive, are not a Trump supporter. You said consistently throughout your career that you're a very progressive person, yet these students at your university were calling you a racist. Do you think they actually believed that you are a racist? What's their motivation behind calling you that? One of the worst terms you could call anyone.
The problem is that they have redefined the term racism. And in fact, if you listen to them, what they tell you will suggest that, of course, I automatically would be a racist by virtue of my skin color. In fact, it's an incurable condition, which does raise the question about why they're so intent on engaging in these mental retraining exercises. If it is, in fact, futile to fight white supremacy because it is ingrained in every white person's mind, then putting people through trainings is unlikely to function. But if we put that aside, let's just simply recognize that their definition of the term involves both speech and silence being violence. And in that circumstance, there's just simply no way to win. They've defined the rules of the game that way.
In those last 3 years, what has changed on the university campuses? Have things got better? Have things got worse? And especially when we look at 2020 with the Black Lives Matter protest, the US election, coronavirus, has that just accelerated all of this kind of woke movement?
Yes, in fact, the phenomenon that we saw at Evergreen has now spilled over into virtually every institution in the United States and is spreading even outside of our borders. This madness, in almost exactly the same form that we saw it at Evergreen, is taking over governance. It is taking over corporations, and it's a very dangerous phenomenon. As I warned Congress, it would be. It was inevitable that if we trained college students to believe these things, that as they moved into the world, eventually they would unleash these views and they would topple these institutions. And now that's what we're seeing.
academics like yourself like to talk about identity politics, and you just mentioned there in quite vague terms the ideas that these students believe. Can we be very specific in saying what actually are these ideas? What are the ideas of the woke movement? What is identity politics? Can we try and define that to understand the things that students believe and are being taught?
The first thing you have to understand is that belief means different things to different people. And for me, as a scientist, belief is a conclusion that I reach based on the evidence I see. And if the evidence changes, the belief will follow. But emerging out of critical race theory, these protesters believe that all there is power, and that these claims are simply effective or not effective at garnering power and resources. So to say that they believe them is a bit of an error. What they do is wield them. And to the extent that in wielding these ideas, institutions bend the knee, that tells them that these ideas are correct. Really what it means is that the ideas are effective at changing people's behavior. But the two are not synonymous. So what do they believe? It really depends. If you're talking about the academics who are at the core of critical race theory, well, they believe in an aggressive version of postmodernism, and they believe in Marxism. If you're talking about the rank and file who are showing up on the street and attacking buildings and neighborhoods, they may not believe in critical race theory. In fact, they may barely have heard of it. What they believe is that something is very wrong and that the solution to it involves tearing down all of the structure.
Essentially, they believe, I think that the whole Black Lives Matter issue, in a way, can be boiled down into one belief, and that is that we live in an institutionally or systemically racist society. How do you respond to that accusation?
It's complex because I do believe that there are serious, long-standing race issues, but I also believe that they don't function in the way that this movement is telling us they do. The anarchism at the heart of this movement, the belief that by tearing down this broken structure, that a better one will emerge in its place, is simply nonsense. Even for those who are the victims of racism, the functioning of society is important. And the correct thing to do is to fix what's wrong rather than tear it down in the hopes that a better system will emerge. That kind of utopianism is going to result in an absolute disaster across the West.
I want to talk about that absolute disaster in the second half of the interview. I read on your website, things aren't looking too great, to put it lightly, and I'll quote you on that later. But first of all, I want to ask an interesting question, I think, about your own beliefs, in that you call yourself a progressive, yet the things that you come out with, the things that we were talking about now about opposing Marxism and a whole series of critical race theory and things like that would mostly, I would say, be seen as, I don't know, a conservative position online, or most people would probably suspect that's a conservative position. So how can you call yourself a progressive and still be against this kind of Black Lives Matter movement or this kind of woke movement today?
Well, I don't regard the Black Lives Matter movement or the woke movement as the least bit progressive. I find them absolutely illiberal and certainly nothing if not reckless. My belief that I am a progressive derives from the fact that I think the systems that we have inherited are not up to the challenge of managing society in the 21st century. And although many of the values at the core of the West are the right values, that the system itself needs an upgrade at many different levels in order for humanity to survive. So I believe that just simply by any reasonable definition, someone who imagines that we must make progress or we will perish is a progressive. As for believing the things that most other progressives believe, I don't share their understanding of the problems for the most part, and I certainly do not believe that there is any merit whatsoever in the idea that simply destroying civilization is going to result in an improved version of it. The fact is, the West is a prototype of sorts, and it achieved spectacular things, much better than you would imagine from even a very good prototype. And the right thing to do is to finish the project, to figure out what the structure did not have correct and to upgrade those things. The idea of uninventing the West is impossibly foolish because the effect will certainly be negative for all of the nations involved and probably for the globe as a whole.
That's a really interesting way of putting it, because I'm sure many conservatives would basically agree with what you just said in terms of, well, let's take the things that the West got right. Let's say free market ideas of capitalism, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. The US Constitution, fantastic document, is a great example of that. And let's cherish those things and let's keep those things. So, how do you respond to that?
Well, I think the values are right. And what's more, I think that a focus on liberty is an excellent focus. This is something that conservatives have been way ahead on in recent decades. And the reason that a focus on liberty is so useful is that in order to be truly liberated, you have to solve all of the other problems. You can't be truly liberated in a system that's wildly unfair or that creates tremendous risk for you if you have a medical catastrophe. In order to be liberated, you have to address all of those other issues. So it's a great goal to shoot for. And the progress we've made on it is simply stunning. So to the extent that that progress is not fairly distributed, the obvious correct objective is the one that the civil rights movement had, which is to make sure that the distribution of well-being is fair, which is not to say perfectly equal. What we have in this woke movement, though, is not even a proper Marxist belief in the equivalent distribution of well-being. It's actually arguing for an inversion of past oppression. And some of the past oppression that it is arguing about is actually imaginary. So to reverse the tables of oppression as a remedy is a very dangerous path to go down. It will not result in a stable system going forward. It will not result in a desirable distribution of well-being. And it will, in fact, so hobble the West that we will not be able to move forward if we begin to attempt it.
What do the woke people say about the sciences? Now, this is an area that you're obviously interested in. It's the area that you study and teach. What do they say about sciences? What do they say about the STEM subjects?
The first time I heard them on this topic, I was so shocked to hear anybody make the claims that they were making that I almost had to wonder whether I was perhaps in a dream. Because what they say is that science itself is racist, and that therefore we need not credit anything that it has come up with. In fact, we need some sort of substitute for it, which is an incredible thing to argue, because if science has a primary purpose, it is to correct for human biases. Science is not a simple process. It is in many ways not the most efficient way to get from A to B. But the reason that it has surpassed all other systems is that no matter how strong your belief is in something, science will tell you if it's wrong if you do the science correctly. So to the extent that this movement is challenging human biases, the best tool in the arsenal is science. And to the extent that science has been done imperfectly, the remedy for it is more and better science.
Do you see them as anti-science? I know that many people would talk about the idea of a man and a woman being biologically different. Some of those on the woke side would say that that's not right. And there's other arguments that they make, which people say, well, actually, hang on. Scientifically, that's not right. Or, and you've talked about the unconscious bias argument as well. Donald Trump recently has just banned these kind of unconscious bias training within the federal government. That's an interesting topic to talk about as well. So do you think overall that these people just don't want to believe in this sort of concept of science because it goes against their fundamental values?
It will be hard to accept what I'm going to say on this topic, but I don't even think anti-science captures it. It's almost like an allergy to science. Anything that has any consistency with science is understood to be incorrect. And really, I think we just ought to take them at their word. When they tell you things that you know have to be false, like some men menstruate, right? Or 2 + 2 can equal 5. they're telling you what they think about logic and reason and any sort of systematic process by which you might determine what's true and what isn't true. They are attacking the very foundation of our ability to reason and to communicate.
They have a lot of anger. A lot of people are angry, and you can see that in the streets in America and in Europe as well. With the Black Lives Matter riots this year, in many places, shops were burnt down. There's lots of looting. People died. Unfortunately, they were killed. There's a lot of anger being built up, and it feels like for a movement that loves to talk so much about love and acceptance, they sure do have a lot of anger. And also, we talk about cancel culture. What happened to you and Evergreen in 2017, where they basically harassed you? And many, many other people are being driven out of their jobs for holding the wrong opinions. People have been, driven out of their jobs for doing things that just so seem to everyone else so and utterly meaningless and just completely normal. And yet, to these people, it's some kind of aggression or whatever it is. So, where does this anger, where does this emotion come from?
Well, this is the place where I might depart from others who are so critical of this movement. I think the anger is actually genuine in most cases, and their anger is being weaponized. They are being captured because they are angry and they don't know exactly what they are angry about. They are easy prey for a movement that claims to have all the answers, claims to know who the villains are, and is ready to go after them with pitchforks and torches. And so I do think, in some sense, the problem is that the indifference that has been displayed, especially in the US, to those at the bottom of the economic ladder, is so extreme that it has created a moment in which a movement was ready to be born. And unfortunately, what captured that energy is absolutely incoherent, self-serving, and lethal, which means it threatens to upend the American project for nothing.
It's interesting you described the woke movement like that, because you could flip it on its head and you say, well, actually, many Trump supporters feel like they've been left behind, feel like they've been ignored. And these people a lot of them aren't rich people. What in the UK we would describe them probably as working class, and the exact same thing happened in Britain with Brexit, and following that, a vote for Boris Johnson, the Conservative Prime Minister, who won a big election last year. And many people say this is because of the left behind voters, those people who have been ignored for 20, 30 years by establishment figures. How would you respond to this kind of argument that you could flip it both ways?
Oh, I think this is exactly what happened. In the US, we saw it very clearly on both sides of the political aisle. We saw two insurgent candidacies. We saw Donald Trump in 2016 on the right, and we saw Bernie Sanders on the left. Both of these were clearly challenges to the party orthodoxy. In Trump's case, he defeated the party. He decapitated it. In Sanders' case, he nearly did, and DNC's skullduggery upended him in the final phase. But clearly, the American electorate was livid with the parties, as it should be, and it was ready to throw them overboard. So the problem is, if you had coherent answers to the question, that energy might be moving us in a positive direction. But the parties in the US have been very effective at preventing any reasonable alternative from emerging. So in some sense, very justifiable anger has resulted in the election of a strangely anti-establishment candidate in Trump, but it's not a good answer. In fact, it's a very dangerous answer. So what you have is a movement ready to happen that could do very positive things, but on a menu of incoherent answers, it's going to pick one of those incoherent answers, and we're going to bounce around from one kind of nonsense to the other.
Could Joe Biden solve all these issues in November?
That is the most preposterous idea I think I've ever heard, and I know you're not offering it in earnest, but I find it incredible that anybody imagines that Joe Biden is the solution to any problem. In fact, he's almost an empty set. Now, he wasn't always that way. At one point, he was a very effective machine politician, but he's so old at this point, and his decrepitude is so obvious that it is almost like we would literally be electing an empty shirt.
So you're not a fan of Trump and you're not a fan of Biden. Let's talk about Unity 2020. What is that?
Unity 2020 was my emergency proposal for what to do when both parties have handed you non-viable answers to how to govern the nation. And it was constructed so as to defeat the main objection to any offering outside of the major parties. In the US, whenever you propose that somebody might run outside of the major parties, you are told you can't possibly do that because to the extent that your values might be over here and you might propose a solution that's over here, you will draw support away from whichever of the major parties is closer to you and thereby elect the greater evil. So that lesser evil, greater evil paradox prevents people from ever marshaling a credible third party option. So my proposal was that we build something that structurally does not risk spoiling the election and therefore can be contemplated by people who wish to move out of the duopoly structure. And what I proposed is that we draft two people, one from the left, one from the right, that they would have three characteristics as a requirement. They would have to be capable, they would have to be courageous, and they would have to be patriotic, that we would draft them together under the agreement that they would govern as a team by consensus, except where that was impossible. Hopefully, we would choose people who would be able to govern by consensus and therefore would not need to depart from that structure. Who would run at the top of the ticket would be chosen by a coin flip. And then after 4 years, whoever had inhabited the role of the president would revert to the role of vice president and vice versa. And this could go on until one party had inhabited the presidency twice, at which point they would be replaced. And this could go on indefinitely.
And what happened to that project?
That project is alive and well. And actually, we have done remarkable things. We have nominated two people to draft. So this is always formulated as a draft, right? We have to provide the groundswell that would justify people of the caliber we're talking about joining our movement and running on our ticket. And our movement, it advanced 6 names, 3 from the left, 3 from the right, and then we held a ranked choice vote of the 9 possible tickets of those individuals, and we came up with what I believe is a marvelous ticket. Tulsi Gabbard and Dan Crenshaw were the top pick of our supporters, and second was Andrew Yang and Admiral William McRaven. I think either of those tickets would be absolutely excellent, and I don't think there's a person on earth crazy enough in their private moment not to think that either of those tickets would be better than the major party offerings.
What kind of response have you had so far from this idea? I mean, and also in practical terms, what's going to happen next? Can you put these two candidates up for election? Are they actually up for it, Tulsi Gabbard and Dan Crenshaw?
Well, it is late, and there are pathways to their election that go right up to election day. But we have promised our supporters that we will pull the plug on the plan if we get to a point that it is clear that the ticket is not viable. And so we are in a middle ground position where we have achieved a ranked choice vote. We have established that we can generate tickets that catalyze the imagination, that bring people hope. And the problem is that the electorate is still so traumatized by the claim that if you do anything outside the major parties, that you will elect the greater evil, that even though Americans are fiercely divided over who that greater evil might be, they are too timid to engage Unity 2020 at the level that would be necessary in order to make it work. And so we are hoping that people will realize, as they are watching the Biden campaign fail to gain momentum, and they are actually watching what support it has, the blue no matter who coalition is actually beginning to evaporate. It's evaporating because people are watching the cities, American cities, torn apart. They are watching the Democratic Party actually humor the movement that's doing all of this destructive stuff. And so what that is doing is it's creating support for Trump amongst people who never thought they would contemplate voting for him. So in light of that dangerous situation, you would imagine that many people would begin to contemplate something that they never thought they would, which is there another option on the table that might be capable of averting that disaster?
I want to talk about something that's on your website that sounds like it could have come out of the Mayans in 2012, or someone on the street shouting, "We're all doomed." But I want to chat about why you think that might be the case. Now, I've got a quote here. It says, "If humanity continues down our current path, we will not survive." Why won't we survive?
Well, this is actually fairly straightforward. I mean, if you just simply extrapolate from the kinds of processes that we now routinely engage and you project forward, the fact is the Earth can't handle it. And if you imagine that there will always be some sort of technological fix for the harm that we are causing to all of these complex processes, then maybe you don't believe that. But if you realize that sometimes the fix that you need is there, and oftentimes it isn't, and therefore it is incumbent on us as humans to build a system that does not constantly throw us into existential danger, then you know our current trajectory is lethal and probably in the short term. So it is true. People are always claiming that the world is coming to an end, and they are always wrong, or at least they have been. What's different here is that we actually have the tools to know what the consequences of the processes we are engaged in will be. And we can see, we keep having these near misses. They're not at the right scale to take out the population, but they begin to tell us that we are approaching that place, right? We've seen triple meltdown at Fukushima. We've seen the Aliso Canyon disaster in Southern California, where a reservoir of natural gas sprung a leak. We saw the Deepwater Horizon. We saw the financial crisis of 2008 nearly throw the world economy into absolute chaos. And we've now seen COVID spread across the globe in a matter of weeks. Now, is COVID going to drive humanity extinct? It is not, right? Is the Deepwater Horizon going to kill humanity? It will not. But we are playing with processes at a scale that was absolutely unimaginable to the people who built the protections into our system. And it is time for us to level up.
Can you talk specifics? I mean, in my mind, what pops up as soon as you mention the end of humanity, I think, well, the biggest thing that people talk about is climate change. Is that what you're talking about, or is there something else? Is it social, political? What exactly is it that's leading down this terrible path?
Well, there are a number of things. For one thing, it doesn't have to be one cause. Climate change can make things very bad. It can degrade the quality of life for humans, but it won't drive human beings extinct. There will be habitable places left. That is, if it unfolds in isolation. But all of our systems are linked together. And so a catastrophic event of one kind can trigger instability of many others. For example, climate change could trigger a massive refugee crisis and be politically very unstabilizing in a world in which there's plenty of nuclear firepower to drive humanity extinct. How would that unfold? Nobody can say with precision, but is it dangerous? I think we all know that it is. But much closer to home, let's just simply talk about the fact that we have the risk of what would be called a Carrington event that could, at any moment, trigger the failure of large swaths of the electrical grid. You could have a solar storm take out a third of the North American electrical power in a way that it can't be restored for many months. What's hooked to that electrical power? Nuclear reactors, many of them. What happens to those nuclear reactors if they fail to get power over a period of days? They melt down. Now, there are, of course, contingency plans. Diesel fuel is the primary one that will keep nuclear reactors running in the event of a Carrington event. But that assumes that the source of diesel power is not also interrupted. So we are constantly running the risk that these systems that we have hooked together will fail one at a time, and that our backup plans will function. But in the case of Carrington event and its connection to the grid and therefore to nuclear power plants, we've left ourselves a huge vulnerability, and for no reason. The fact is, it would be very simple and cheap to fix the problem with the grid. We could have backup transformers ready to go. This would cost a few $billions to do, but it would not be an amount of money that would actually be difficult to raise in light of the major hazard posed by a Carrington event. And yet we don't do it because the hazard is not high enough on people's radar.
Speaking as a complete layman in evolutionary theory, please correct me on this if this is completely off piece, but my sort of hypothesis in my head is that isn't one of the lessons of evolution and biology just how adaptable animals, human beings are, and how brilliant we are at inventing solutions to potential problems. And isn't it the case that humans have faced absolute catastrophe over hundreds and thousands of years, and we've all managed to survive and even thrive? I'm thinking of the Black Death that killed half the population in Europe, and that led to actually a lot of good, positive social changes. And there's plenty of other, we had the 1929 Wall Street crash. That was absolutely disastrous. We've had World War II. We were on the brink of the nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we still somehow managed to sort of muddle through all that. So isn't it the case that we're sort of adaptable?
We are the most adaptable species that has ever been. And were we playing with processes where adaptation was the proper response, then I would be very hopeful. The problem is that our industrial world is playing with processes for which there is no conceivable mode of adaptation. I mean, the fact is, massive releases of radiation are a hazard, and if that radiation is coming from spent fuel in nuclear reactors, you're talking about isotopes that have half-lives in the hundreds of thousands of years. There's no way around it, and so we have to see those things coming. And frankly, the best tool that we have as creatures who are built to adapt is foresight. At some point, you have to realize that your ancestors were playing with processes that put a certain amount at risk, yes, but never the entire project. And that now we are playing with processes that could destroy the species. And at the point you're playing with processes at that scale, one has to take on a different view of risk.
I want to talk about some of your solutions. Again, quoting from your website right now, you talk about 3 different solutions. Given similar circumstances, people are basically alike. That's what you say, number 1. An excellent world is possible, but perfection is not an option. The future cannot be designed. It will have to be discovered. Can you go through each of those points and explain what they mean?
Sure. I'm trying to remember which one you quoted first.
Given similar circumstances, people are basically alike.
Yeah, this is a hypothesis. I'm quite confident of it, having visited numerous different cultures and interacted with people over long periods of time. But the hypothesis is that if you were to raise people in similar circumstances, they would end up seeing the world similarly. Their values would be approximately alike. And to the extent that we see people valuing very different things, it's the result of different developmental environments. And this is, of course, difficult to test because there are so many different environments in play that it's a very noisy situation in which to see pattern. But nonetheless, I see no evidence whatsoever to expect otherwise. People want the same sorts of things, and that means that generating a world that provides desirable things to everyone and that provides incentives that motivate us all in the same direction is not inconceivable.
Number 2, perfection is not an option.
Yeah, this is simple, straightforward engineering logic that you can see in complex systems. There is a trade-off, I would argue, between every 2 desirable characteristics of some mechanism or creature. And that means that very frequently we're stuck with a situation in which you can have most of something. You can have 80% of something, but as you push towards 100%, you cause every other value to crash. And therefore, if we're going to build a society that functions very, very well, we have to accept that having most of all of our values met is what we want, and that anybody who is selling an idea in which we pursue 100% on any possible value is actually sowing the seeds of our destruction.
And finally, the future cannot be designed, it must be discovered.
The idea here is that we are talking about a complex system, and that means we're talking about something in which the parts are interrelated in ways that we cannot fully model. So we can define what we want the structure to accomplish, but it's not like a bridge or a building where we can define tolerances and map it out. What we have to do is have a process that heads us in the direction of that which we wish to accomplish, and then evaluates how well we succeeded. What were the consequences that we didn't foresee, that are negative, that we wish to hedge out? Because every proposal that attempts to achieve something desirable and new has unintended consequences. And so this iterated prototyping process is the only rational way that we could get to a system that would function much better than ours. And if somebody tells you they know how to get there directly, they know how to blueprint it, they're either delusional or lying.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that these, let's call them three solutions to the problems that you talk about, aren't just aimed at governments or big businesses, but they're also aimed at the ordinary person. What can the average person watching this video at home now do to prevent this catastrophe?
Well, I think, frankly, the only thing that we can do is recognize that it's coming and attempt to coordinate our resistance to it. That is to say, we need to halt the process by which people are becoming captured. And that's not a simple thing to do because, as I pointed out before, the stigma that people fear is a very powerful motivator. But if we can get people to recognize the hazard, if we can get them to listen to what the movement is advocating enough to understand that there's no desirable system that could possibly be built by people who believe there's any disagreement or basis for one over whether 2 + 2 = 4 or whether men and women are fundamentally different, that people who are telling you that these things are somehow open to debate are not in a position to build a society, and we have to resist them, which means we have a society. To the extent there are things wrong with it, we should address them, but we should not overreact.
So in terms of applying these quite abstract ideas that you talk about it to the real world, let's take the woke movement, which I think is basically what you're talking about in the last answer that you gave. You talk about, for example, people can't go for 100% perfection. And a lot of these woke types would say we need to end racism. We need to live in this kind of new utopia society. We've got to tear down what we have. So in terms of, applying this in practical terms in people's lives, what do you suggest for people to do? Is it more critical thinking, more reading? What is it?
Well, this is going to sound, I fear, too vague, but I'm pretty sure it's the right answer. People need to approach each other with more curiosity, more imagination, and more generosity of spirit. If you go into the world imagining that there's vile racism around every corner and that every nuance is potentially a microaggression, then you will no doubt find things to validate that perspective. On the other hand, if you give people a chance to tell you what they really think, how they feel, what world they want, you might well be surprised at how much we are alike. And the thing I fear most is that the process that is unfolding is doing a very good job of making us ununderstandable to each other. When I talk about the unity movement, this is really about bridging a gap that I see growing every day, recognizing that the people across the political aisle are not monsters, that they see things differently, Undoubtedly, they have things wrong, but surely you do as well. And figuring out what those things are is in all of our interest. This is the right process, and it always has been. And it is time for us to return to it immediately because, frankly, we're much closer to the precipice than we should have allowed ourselves to get.
That first point about people basically being alike is a really interesting one. Let's talk a little bit about that. There's two contrasting ideas of society today, and they're so contrasting. It's so strange to me that they could even, that both ideas are so prominent. The first is that, as you say, we live in a systemically racist society. Microaggressions lie behind every corner. If you're a white person, there's a lot of problems with you inherently, and you've got to sort out your racist issues. Basically, things aren't great, and for minorities, they're oppressed, and there's huge injustices in the world. And I'm sure there's some truth to that. The opposite way of looking at things is that actually we live in the best society that's ever been created. There's no better time ever to be a human being. Poverty is down, wealth is up. We've got the internet. In my pocket, I can look up anything I want. Even 20 years ago, you couldn't do that. So how did we get to this point where you've got one half of the population, I'm being very, generalistic saying that, who believe that we live in this terrible hell of a society, and the other half that said, actually, this is the best society we've ever lived in?
Well, the folks who say it's the best society we've ever lived in, if we speak broadly, they're right. The fact is we have accomplished the impossible. And the most important thing we've accomplished is a society in which we are actually largely in agreement that we do not want structural unfairness to favor one population over another. That's new, and we've done very well. We have not done perfectly. And unfortunately, evolution handed us a major liability. It made humans very sensitive to inequity. And the reason that it did that is very straightforward. In my opinion, the reason that we became more sensitive to inequity than we are to our absolute level of well-being is that if you, let's say that you were a hunter-gatherer ancestor and you're living in the Kalahari and you look at another population of hunter-gatherers also living in the Kalahari and they're doing much better than you, it means they know something that you don't. And therefore, paying attention to the fact that they're doing much better, becoming obsessed with it is probably in your interest because you might figure out what it is that they know and be able to do it yourself. But in a world in which your understanding of how your neighbors are doing is polluted by the fact that you're seeing it through screens in which they are advancing a very particular brand that may be deceptive. And the fact is, they're not really your neighbors in the same sense that another population of hunter-gatherers are. They may have profited from different opportunities that you don't have. So the fact that they're out competing you doesn't mean you're doing something wrong or that you're missing something. So what we have is people very sensitive to inequality in a world in which inequality is extreme, and they're obsessed with it. Now, there's an awful lot of that inequality that probably isn't productive, that is the result of rent-seeking behavior. That is to say, people hoarding opportunity. And so, as I said earlier, I think much of the anger is justified and that there is something to remedy. But if you think that what is causing opportunity to concentrate is people's racism, that they're imagining things that they're not saying, then you'll be wrong very frequently. That's not the mechanism at all. And the mechanism doesn't require them to be racist. Even if it is a racial inequality, it can happen through the fact that our system tends to reproduce and amplify whatever imbalances existed in the prior state. And so to the extent that there was historical racism that has people from a disadvantaged group in a given zip code, and that zip code collects taxes which can't compete with some other zip code, and then those taxes are used to generate schools, well, that will tend to reproduce low quality schools in places where people have been previously disadvantaged by racism without anybody being racist. So we have to be more nuanced about this. We have to be open to the possibility that there are problems that need to be addressed without assuming, without leaping to the conclusion that the explanation for those problems is the most obvious one.
Capitalism, the West, freedom, all of the things that brought us to this point where, as you say, I mean, statistically, you can't really disprove this, that human beings are in the best position they've ever been. This has produced huge amounts of inequality. And, many people, especially on the right, would argue, well, in a way, this is justified inequality in that capitalism will always produce vast amounts of inequality. But what it does is it lifts everyone up from poverty and gives everyone a huge amount of wealth. But unfortunately, it does get concentrated at the top. And people like Jordan Peterson would say, well, that's just a natural part of being a human being. This is about hierarchies, and capitalism basically encapsulates hierarchies and magnifies it. And then that sort of idea of hierarchies and huge amounts of inequality, as you say, there are many sort of irrational moral hazard problems with that, where things aren't distributed fairly, and there's problems that need to be regulated and sorted out. So that's a whole nother issue. But this whole conflict between hierarchy, inequality, and the essential human nature of what I might call jealousy, maybe that's too harsh, but where, as you mentioned earlier, looking over at the other tribes, seeing an inequality and being angry about that, has that conflict basically created the anger that we see today? And as you mentioned in the first part of your answer, relative to 200 years ago, these Black Lives Matter protesters are in a fantastic place, but they still say that we live in a hell of a society.
Well, this is one of these places where I think both the left and the right have it tragically wrong, but they each have a part of the truth. We are very well positioned in absolute terms. I mean, as you point out, we're all carrying in our pocket a device that allows us to access something far greater than the Library of Alexandria without ever getting out of our seat. That's an amazing bit of wealth that we all have access to. On the other hand, the right tends to see all of the inequality as desirable because some of the inequality is necessary in order to incentivize the production of the marvelous things from which we all profit. But we have to ask the question, what fraction? What is the ideal amount of inequality to drive the system? And I suspect if we did ask that question, we'd find that we have excessive inequality. What's more, the fact that some inequality is necessary in order to get people to strive does not mean that we have to let people fall off the bottom of the ladder into conditions from which they cannot recover. It becomes a permanent state of poverty. So were we to fix the safety net so that people were not wiped out by bad luck and provide proper incentives, and most importantly, were we to seek to distribute opportunity as evenly as possible. Wealth can concentrate to an extent, and that's fine, but opportunity should never concentrate. And so if we were to focus on the question that way, I think we would get much farther, because we would realize that it's almost impossible to make an argument in favor of the concentration of opportunity, and yet anybody who's paying attention knows that opportunity is far from evenly distributed.
As someone who studies evolution, you have an absolutely fantastic advantage, I think, in life to historians, in that you can, what I think this phrase in America is very popular, but you can sort of take a 30,000 foot view of history, of human history, and of human beings, and you can look at a really, really, really big picture of how we have progressed. What is it, in your view, what are the driving factors behind the fantastic amounts of wealth and prosperity that we've seen in the last few hundred years in humanity? And how can you link that in with how human beings behave, and why we haven't had this huge amount of progress until relatively very, very recently?
Well, it's a marvelous question, I should say. I think there are a couple of things that are contributing to it. Some of them are arbitrary. So our discovery of fossil fuels allowed us to unleash a huge amount of energy, literal energy, into the system. And that energy has led to an awful lot of wealth creation. Now, it has come at a price, to be sure, but nonetheless, we are profiting from that one-time liberation of all of that energy into our economic system. That's one thing. Second thing is, I think, a bit more hopeful, which is the American experiment, which I take to have been largely globalized. So many countries have followed our example and set up their own versions of it. But that experiment trades on the idea that we are much better off collaborating with each other for reasons that have nothing to do with relatedness than we are to stick to our tribes. And it turns out that's a very profitable idea. It allows you to exchange concepts with people you would not otherwise collaborate with. And the magic that comes from the breadth of contribution of different cultures to our overarching culture is staggering. So this is one of the things that frightens me most about this moment, is that we are taking this hidden engine of progress, the ability to collaborate with people and not worry about whether or not you're closely related to them. We're going to take that idea and we are going to return to a prior state in which we view everybody as kin or not kin and proceed from there. And that's really a great example of killing the goose that lays the golden eggs.
There's an interesting debate among historians, postmodernists, about human progress in general. And I think from that answer, you've implied there that, a huge amount of progress, which is, we can look at this statistically, I'm sure this is true, that a huge amount of progress has happened since the 18th century, for example. Let's put the pinpoint there. But I don't necessarily like to subscribe to the view that, everything before the American Constitution or fossil fuels or wherever you want to put the pinpoint in history wasn't necessarily progress. Is it your view that 300, 400, 500 years ago we had this huge amount of progress economically, socially, politically, etc.? You can see that in population statistics. You can see that in material things of technology development and everything like that. But before this huge area of enlightenment, what lessons can we learn from humanity there? And was there a progression throughout that historical period of thousands of years, before the Enlightenment period?
Absolutely. Although I do think we should focus on the Enlightenment, because in part the Enlightenment did proceed from a relaxation of the intense competition that preceded the Dark Ages. So the fact of people being effectively economically well positioned because Europe was suddenly less populous and there was therefore more resource per person was a generative phenomenon. And I think we've seen, if we look for this evidence, I think we will see it all over the place in various different forms. So in Europe, it was an accident. In Mesoamerica, we see numerous examples of incredibly impressive societies having emerged over a very short number of millennia from hunter-gatherers who came into North America at the end of the last ice age. And these societies somehow managed to prevent the internal competition that might have been expected to tear them apart from doing so. And it would be very valuable if we understood what those processes were at a level that allowed us to actually generate them for ourselves. And I suspect if humanity survives long enough, we will come to understand that there is essentially a formula for creating stable well-being, and that our job at all moments is to seek that formula so that we can provide liberty to as many people as possible.
You've predicted my final question there, so I suspect you might not have an answer to it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What is it that is innate? What is it that is innate in us that makes us progress? What makes us, as you say, you're progressive? What has made humanity progress in such a way? What is it in our evolution that has driven this?
Well, in one way, we're like every other creature. We seek increases in well-being that frequently then manifest in increases in population. Now, that's a tragic connection because, in general, it means that when a creature has found some sort of burst of what I would call growth, that they squander it on more mouths to feed. But in the human case, there's also something special going on, which is that the mechanism by which we search for opportunity is conscious. And because we are conscious, we are capable of choosing what path to take. We are capable of foreseeing catastrophe and avoiding it. We are capable of deciding to prioritize values that other creatures must discount. And we are all too prone to revert to a lower state, a prior, more animal state, and neglect our greatest gift. But we do so at our peril. The fact is, human beings have consciousness, and it frees us to understand where we are headed and to do so with intention.
And on that semi-positive note, thank you so much, Bret, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.